Today's topic is fascinating. What we're going to ask today is there any scientific evidence for the existence of an afterlife, right? Scientific evidence? Well, first of all, we have to be very clear. You can't start with a belief and work backward to look for confirming evidence to support that belief. It's a confirmation bias. That's not how science is done. Science is done by asking a question, collecting data if you can, looking at the existing evidence, and then making your best conclusion. And sometimes that's going to be an inference, and you just going to have to go from there. So there are a lot of people who believe in an afterlife, maybe because of religion, and they search for evidence to confirm that belief. You can't do that in science. But there's a lot of atheists in the scientific community that are certain that there is no afterlife and claim that there is evidence, scientific evidence, to support that conclusion. What I'm going to look at today is whether or not that happens to be true. So the first point I want to make is that every scientific argument against the existence of an afterlife ultimately depends on the following statement. You ready? And that statement is, consciousness is entirely produced by the brain. Now, maybe someone may say, well, actually, it's produced by the entire body. But it doesn't really matter for the sake of the argument. The point is that to believe that science leads you to a conclusion that there is no afterlife always necessarily depends on this statement or some close derivative thereof. So we're going to look at this. Consciousness is entirely produced by the brain. If that's true, you destroy the brain, you must destroy consciousness, right? If this statement is true, the person dies, the brain is dead, consciousness must die with it. And the question is there any evidence to support this statement? Well, let's ask the first question, which is there any direct empirical evidence to support this statement? No, there's not. But that's not because of a shortcoming in science. It's because there is logically no way to have direct evidence to support this statement. And here's why. I need my brain to talk. I need my brain to control the rest of my body. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to kill my brain and see whether or not I'm still conscious. But how could you possibly test that if killing my brain prevents me from telling anyone, hey, I'm still conscious, right? So in other words, there can't be direct empirical evidence of this because logically that's not possible. There's no way to do a test. We can't kill a body or see a dead body and then inquire as to whether or not that person is still conscious because they can't use that body to say, yes, I'm still conscious. So this has no direct empirical evidence as a logical matter. It's not a shortcoming in science. There's just no way to actually test that. So the question now is there any scientific reason at all to believe this statement that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain or by the body? Well, it is absolutely indisputable that the brain is directly tied to consciousness, right? You have a strong cup of coffee in the morning that causes chemicals, etc., in the brain that changes your awareness, that changes your state of consciousness, right? I mean, there's no doubt that things that happen in the brain and brain chemistry affect our conscious state. Just like if I stub my toe, that also will affect my conscious state. Now, you might say, well, that sends signals up a neural path into my brain and ultimately affects the chemistry, and really it's just the brain that causes consciousness. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's indisputable that the body and the brain are closely linked with our conscious awareness. No doubt. But is that enough to then infer that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain? Well, no. there are lots of things in the world that I can affect. I can affect this marker, but I didn't produce it, and that's not evidence that I produced it. So the mere fact that the brain and the body affect consciousness is not evidence that they are entirely responsible for the production of consciousness. However, if you have nothing else, if you have no other data, no other information, all you knew was that when things happen in the brain, things also often happen in that person's conscious state. If that's all the information you had, nothing else, would this be a reasonable inference? And it is an inference. I don't know. And that's not what I'm here to argue. But what's important to recognize is that every scientific argument against the existence of an afterlife ultimately depends on some close derivative of this statement, that consciousness is entirely produced by the brain or the body. When those die, when those are destroyed, consciousness goes with it. If you could know for certain that this statement is false, that in fact consciousness depends on something outside of the brain or outside of the body or outside a local volume, is what we would call it in physics. If you knew that for certain, you'd have a real problem then, because you wouldn't know whether or not consciousness would be extinguished with the death of the brain, because you would have no evidence at that point that the brain causes consciousness. We clear on this? You all recognize this statement, right, from the last seminar. This is what we spent last seminar logically disproving. Something like this statement is logically false. And what I mean by that, a conscious state cannot be produced by a local volume of information physically. And that's what I showed in the last seminar. So in the last seminar, I showed that if you took two conscious states produced by physical brain states, bounded in local volumes, and separate them in space-time, that can't happen because it produces a logical contradiction. So this is actually logically false. Isn't that amazing? It's logically false. I'm not the only one who realized this. I'll put a link in the video to a paper, and I'll give that paper to you. There was a Professor Stoika who showed, again on a logical basis, that conscious states are non-local, which is very similar to what I showed in the last seminar. He showed that conscious states are non-local, which means that conscious states cannot be bounded in a local volume, which means they can't be produced entirely by the brain. This was shown logically in a different way, but a very creative way, a beautiful way. And I'll put a link to this. Also, Sir Roger Penrose, an amazing, brilliant man who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, I think 2 years ago, and a colleague of his, Stuart Hameroff, did not show that conscious states are non-local, but are convinced for very good reason, or mostly convinced for very good reason, that quantum mechanics must be involved in consciousness, that conscious states must have a quantum component to them. And they suggest that it has to do with keeping superposition states in nanotubes or something in the brain. I'm not a physician. My wife is a physician. But they are pretty firmly convinced that consciousness depends on quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is, by its nature, non-local. We know that if there are two atoms that are entangled, quantum entangled, that the measurement of one will instantaneously affect the result on the other, no matter how far apart they are. Now, you can't transfer information that way. That would violate special relativity. But the effect is instantaneous. They are entangled. And so they suggest, because consciousness is very, very likely to be quantum mechanical in nature, that it must be non-local. And if it's non-local, then this statement must be false. So what I've shown is, first of all, the argument against an afterlife depends on this statement. But this statement is just an inference, and it's an inadequate inference. But more importantly, this statement is logically false. And I've shown you that. Therefore, there is actually no scientific evidence, direct or indirect, against an afterlife. And that's key, right? That's key. Because when a scientist steps on their science pedestal in their scientific position and tells you, no, you're an idiot for believing in an afterlife, there is no afterlife, science shows it. They're wrong. Ask them, what is the evidence for that? What is the evidence? What's actually happening is that person believes there is no afterlife, and they're looking for reasons to confirm that. But there are no scientific reasons to believe this statement or to believe that there's no afterlife. But it gets better, and here's why. If despite everything I've told you, you still believe that this is true, or the scientist that you're debating, the atheist that you're debating, is not convinced and still says that this is true, okay? It's false. But let's just assume for the moment that it's true. It's false, but let's assume that it's true. What does that mean? If consciousness is entirely produced by the brain, here's the brain inside a person, a very strange-looking person. If that person's consciousness is entirely produced by what's inside the skull, or even inside the body, let's just put some sphere around that person. Yeah, it's a three-dimensional sphere around this person. Well, it turns out that all of the information that can be represented inside that sphere is finite. It's limited by something called the Bekenstein bound. Now, Bekenstein bound is actually massive. It's spelled like this. It's massive. But the point is, there's finite information in there. And all information can be represented by a string of bits. Again, it may be a very long string of bits, but it can be represented by a string of bits. This is uncontested, indisputable in the scientific, computer science, physics communities. Therefore, it's indisputable that the brain that produces this conscious state could, in principle, with good enough technology, be read and recreated elsewhere. It could be copied, right? Because if what's inside this sphere is nothing more than, could be represented as a string of bits. By the way, Scott Aronson at UT Austin wrote a great paper on this and discussed just that isn't it strange? And he assumes that this is true. So he says, isn't it strange that our entire life, everything we've done, all of our experiences, and our entire life can be represented as a string of bits? Isn't that strange? Yes, Scott, it's really strange, and it's wrong. So the point is, if we assume this statement is true, then whatever's inside this sphere can be represented as a string of bits. And I don't think many people in academia would dispute that, yeah, in principle, someday we'll be able to, read brains and figure out what's going on, and maybe someday we'll be able to recreate that brain, and, but fundamentally, if this is not quantum, which Penrose and Hameroff think it is quantum, I think it's quantum, because it's non-local, but if it's not quantum, then whatever's inside here can be read, copied, duplicated elsewhere in space-time, okay? So if that's true, right, we're again saying, so this statement is false, but for those atheists who cling to this, no, this is true, then something weird emerges. Because if this is true, then this conscious state can be represented as a string of bits, which can be copied, which can be written as code. That implies two fascinating things. First of all, it implies that mind uploading is possible. So in other words, if you believe this, if this statement is true, then it must be true that mind uploading is possible in principle. And what mind uploading means is taking someone's consciousness, conscious states, and uploading it to a digital general purpose computer. And the problem, of course, well, it's not a problem. What that means then, computers can be repaired. They can last a very long time. Certainly, longer than any of our bodies can last. And again, they can be repaired. So what that means, if mind uploading is possible, then this person's conscious state can be copied to as many computers as desired. And those computers can live essentially forever, which means there's an afterlife, right? At least consciousness doesn't end, which is exactly the point that I'm trying to make, right? So if mind uploading is possible, which people who believe this must believe, then that means that in principle, they can live forever, right? Which I would say is pretty much the same as their afterlife. Someone might reply, okay, yes, mind uploading might be possible. Okay, it is possible in principle, but it's never going to happen, not in my lifetime. So I'll be dead and gone by the time mind uploading is possible. So I'm not going to live forever. You're not going to live forever. It's a weak argument because the whole point is for an atheist to show that an afterlife doesn't exist, that it's impossible. But we already know that it is possible if they accept the statement that I've already shown to be false. So that's the first interesting thing. But my response to that, when they say, well, it's never actually going to happen in our lifetimes, is this. It's called a Boltzmann brain. A Boltzmann brain is the notion that after this person is dead and gone, this person right here, inside the red circle, inside the sphere, once this person is dead and gone, the universe has lasted a very long time, 14 billion years or something. But assuming the universe isn't going to collapse on itself, assuming it continues to expand forever, and there's very good reason to think that it will continue to expand forever, perhaps even accelerate in its expansion rate. If that's true, then we've got forever. Well, a lot of things happen in forever. The idea is that there are only so many different configurations that the universe can be in. This person's brain and body consists of a whole bunch of atoms that are organized in a particular way, right? When the person dies, those atoms go different places. They go into the soil, they go into the air, etc. Eventually, in a million years, 2 of those atoms that were in this brain randomly come together and bounce off each other. Eventually, enough time, 10 of these atoms randomly come together in a very similar way, and they bounce off each other, whatever. Given enough time, eternity is a long time. Given enough time, with certainty, all of these atoms and molecules will come together in the exact same way as what's inside the sphere. And if what's inside the sphere is what produces this person's conscious state, then that person will be conscious again. Will, with certainty. People who believe this statement, atheists who believe this statement, as long as the universe continues to expand for eternity, as opposed to a big crunch, in which case the argument would be different. If the universe continues to expand forever, there's only a limited number. Now, there's a lot, but there's only a limited number of ways that the atoms in the universe can be organized, which means eventually everything comes back around to what it was before. I think it's called recurrence. It's very strange, but that's the idea. And it's logically true. If there's only limited information in the universe, and the universe lasts forever, eventually all those things come together in the same way they were before. Which means, let's say it happens in 1 trillion years. I don't know, probably way longer than that. But let's say in 1 trillion years, all these atoms come together. And they don't even have to be the same atoms. Although they could be, I suppose. But, if they're, a carbon atom is identical to another carbon atom. So it doesn't even have to be the exact same carbon atoms. But eventually the exact same ones will come together in that same way too. The point is, people who claim this, as long as the universe continues to expand forever, must accept that this person will wake up again. Let that sink in. In 1 trillion years from now, or whatever it happens to be, when all these atoms come together inside this sphere to create the exact same configuration that they claim produces this person's conscious state, that person, the exact same person, will be conscious again, awake again, which means that the person's consciousness cannot end at the person's death on earth. That person will wake up again and again and again and continue to have experiences for eternity. So, and I think, and that's basically like what the Boltzmann brain is the idea that a brain would just randomly come together in the universe and produce a person's conscious identity. There's an interesting book. Frank Tipler is a Christian and a physicist who wrote a book called The Physics of Immortality, and it's very long and very full of equations, and I think his goal was to sound smart and to make it look very, very sciencey and physicsy, because starting as a Christian and working backward and trying to prove the existence of an afterlife already makes you suspect. Just as an atheist, starting with the belief in no afterlife, working back and looking for that confirming evidence makes me suspicious. Well, he had to write a book that had lots of equations in it to get some credibility. I don't think he got much, but that was the idea. After reading it, I think that pretty much his entire argument is this, an eternal recurrence. Just the idea that he makes use of the Bekenstein bound and the idea that there's only limited information in a brain or in a body, and ultimately that has to recur, and eventually this person has to continue, have a next conscious state after that, and a next one, and a next one for the same reason, because eternity is a very, very long time. So, where does this leave us? Well, for the moment, what it tells us is this. Either this statement, either it's true or false, right? Either true or false. Well, I've already shown logically that it's false. And others have shown logically that it's false. And if quantum mechanics has anything to do with consciousness at all, quantum mechanics is non-local in nature, then that is false. But even if a person was convinced that it was true, despite logic, what that implies is this, which is that conscious states are produced by local volumes, like a brain, and that implies that mind uploading is physically possible, and that would by itself imply the possibility of an afterlife, and it implies eternal recurrence of Boltzmann brains, that this person will continue to be conscious. So after this person dies on Earth, that person will wake up again when all those atoms come together in that configuration and have a next conscious state, which means a Boltzmann brains, you'll only have an afterlife with mind uploading if mind uploading were possible in your lifetime. It's not possible at all, but if it were possible. But the Boltzmann brain argument says you will wake up again in the future. Is this amazing? Logic tells us, one, there is no direct or indirect evidence against an afterlife. Two, logic tells us that even if you're certain of this statement, it still implies the existence of an afterlife. So if you take the computer scientists and the atheists at face value, which is that they have to accept this statement, this is where their belief comes from. If they accept this statement, then consciousness is local. The information is bound within a local volume of information, which implies that mind uploading is possible. And a Boltzmann brain guarantees waking up and continuing consciousness for eternity, assuming the universe continues to expand, and it seems like it will continue to expand forever. Now, this is false. Because this is false, and I've shown you it's false, I still haven't given you any evidence at all for the existence of an afterlife. Is there any evidence? I know we're half an hour into this. Have I given you any evidence at all that there is an afterlife? I haven't. Is there any evidence? Well, I would claim that yes, there is. And I'll give you three pieces. The first piece of evidence that I will give you, scientific evidence for the existence of an afterlife. One, I'm just going to call it circumstantial. I would argue that because this statement logically false, that there is something outside of our brains and outside of our bodies that is involved in the production of consciousness. That's true. That's necessarily true. Something outside our bodies. And because the universe is so huge, it's probably things far away from our bodies. Because something outside of our bodies is necessarily involved in the production of consciousness, I would call that at least a little bit of circumstantial evidence for the existence of an afterlife. I mean, it is. You don't have to say it's great evidence. Maybe it's just a tiny bit of evidence, but it's certainly not neutral, and it's certainly not evidence against an afterlife. Therefore, it suggests the existence of an afterlife. So that's not great, but that's my first point. Here's the second point. I'll call it clinical immortality. And here's what that says. Humans are living longer than they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And it is likely that we will continue to figure out how to live longer and maybe figure out even what causes aging. It turns out that aging is actually programmed into our DNA. We're programmed to die. That's what evolution likes. It likes to, bring the young for sexual reproduction and then let the others just die. So it's programmed into our DNA. What if? I mean, we already know something about extending the lives of mice, I think, by adjusting things in their DNA. I don't know too much about it. I've heard a little about it. By adjusting things in their DNA to make them live a little bit longer. Now, what if we found there's some gene in human DNA, we just take it out, and there's no aging anymore at all? We just stay the same age as we are. There's no decay of the body. How likely is that? So let's talk about just probability. Probability P. What's the likelihood of that? What's the likelihood that tomorrow a scientist discovers, oh, this is how you stop aging? And everyone, it's in your genes, it's in your DNA. We cut out this little splice, this little part here. We take it out, and there's no aging that is programmed into the DNA. It doesn't happen anymore. What's the likelihood that happens tomorrow? Really low. Really, really, really low. Really, insanely low, right? I mean, I don't know what odds I'd give you. Vegas odds might be 1 trillion to 1 or something ridiculous. It's very unlikely. But is it zero? Do any of you believe? Probability may be insanely low, but it's not zero. As long as the probability is greater than zero that we figure out a way to stop aging, or we figure out a way to make people live a little bit longer, and then while they're living longer, we figure out more ways to make them live longer, and that just continues indefinitely. The point is, as long as this probability is not zero, then it seems physically possible that you'll continue to live forever. Now, is that the same as an afterlife? Well, you didn't die, but that's the same spirit, right? The question is really, are you going to die and then your consciousness ends? That's really the question, right? So really the question is, does consciousness continue? And clinical immortality would say, yeah, as long as the probability is greater than zero, there is a physical possibility for an afterlife in that sense. The third one I want to give is, I think, the strongest piece of evidence, and it may not even be very good evidence, but it is evidence because at least there's data on it. And it is NDE, near-death experience, and OBE, out-of-body experiences. Now, I'm going to put a link. I'll give you the paper. I'm going to put a link on the video in the description to at least one good paper summarizing the existing data on this. Now, what's important about this? So, near-death experience. This is the idea. So, a near-death experience is people describe clear experiences that happened or seem to have happened during a time that they were dead. Now, what does the word dead mean? There are clinical and medical definitions that change. Is it when, I think at one point years ago, it used to be when the heart stopped, that was death. Maybe now it's when the brain is dead. I don't, again, my wife would know this. I don't know what the definition of death is, but the point is there's some medical definition of death. And there are a lot of experiences, documented experiences of people, anecdotal experiences, that they claim to have these very rich, they weren't dreamlike at all. They're far beyond dreams. They're very vivid. They're very clear. That happened, that the timeline happened at a time when science would claim that they were dead. And then, of course, they were revived, right? Which is why they were able to come back and explain and talk about that near-death experience. Of course it's anecdotal. I think that there might be other ways to test these things, but the point is there's a lot of anecdotal evidence here that, yeah, I spent this amount of time, I had this very vivid, rich experience that felt like a real world, and then I came back to this reality, and and there's no explanation for it. Well, I mean, sorry about that. There are potential explanations for it. Maybe upon death, the brain releases all kinds of chemicals that cause weird hallucinations. You might ask, well, what would have been the evolutionary benefit to having primates release certain chemicals in the brain when they die to feel good? I don't know. But the point is, there always seems to be a counter argument to these near-death experiences that it wasn't an afterlife at all. It was just some sort of brain activity that happened, and you weren't really dead yet. Maybe by a medical definition at the moment you were dead, but you weren't really dead yet. There is no afterlife. My point is, there are lots of good studies, good objective studies on this. There's a lot of very unobjective studies on this, but a lot of good objective studies on near-death experiences, and that at least is some scientific evidence for the existence of an afterlife. And then out-of-body experiences, again, are anecdotal, but they are examples where a person, again, they're clinically dead, and then they claim to rise out of their body, see things, and then when they are revived, they then explain, yeah, I saw this, and I heard this. And it turns out that it would have been impossible, physically impossible, for them to have seen that or known the location of something or heard something, gotten information by hearing something, that it would have been physically impossible to have seen or heard those things or experienced those things unless, indeed, the person's spirit or whatever it is rose out of their body, looked around, saw something that they couldn't have seen otherwise or heard something they couldn't have heard otherwise. And then when they were revived, then they said what they found. Again, it's anecdotal. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were just having a hallucination when they were very near to, they weren't dead. Maybe they weren't dead yet. They were having some weird hallucination and just happened to have guessed something that turned out to be right. I don't know. But the point is, I don't know much about any of this. There are studies on these. I'm simply saying that by my own very limited reading from these, they are at least a little bit of evidence, scientific evidence, that there is an afterlife. And that's pretty much what I can find in terms of science. What I've shown you in this video is that the belief that there is no afterlife hinges on a false statement, a statement that I've shown is logically false. Other people have shown it's logically false. And so if that statement is false, that means there is no scientific evidence, direct or indirect, against the possibility of an afterlife. You can tell that to any diehard atheist who insists that science rejects an afterlife. It doesn't. There's no evidence against it. And then, even if that person says that, oh, this is not a false statement, this is true, then what that implies, as I showed you before, is it implies logically that there is an afterlife in some form, a Boltzmann brain, mind uploading, and so forth. So I've shown you that the statement is false and there's no scientific evidence against this. What is the evidence? Is there any evidence for an afterlife? I think there is a little bit. One, circumstantial evidence, the fact that consciousness is produced, at least in part, by something beyond our brains, beyond this local volume, is at least circumstantial evidence that whatever produces our consciousness won't stop producing it upon death. Maybe weak. And the second, clinical immortality, if there's any likelihood at all, and there is, small, but there is, that science will figure out how to extend life indefinitely, well, that's essentially the same as an afterlife. Your consciousness won't end. But the third, I think, is the strongest, and that is these reports by thousands of people, I believe thousands of, it's usually people who have had heart attacks, and then by a medical definition, they're dead, And then they claim to have had these very rich experiences during times in which they were medically dead. Lots of examples of those, and lots of examples, fewer, but lots of examples of out-of-body experiences where they claim to rise out of their body, see things and hear things, and in some cases see and hear things that they could not have seen or heard if they were using their human eyes and ears. It's debatable. There's a lot of debate about it. There could be lots of explanations that these people were not actually dead, and they may be right. And maybe this isn't very good evidence at all. But the point of this seminar is just to show you that A, there is zero scientific evidence against an afterlife, and there is at least some, even if a smidgen, some scientific evidence for the existence of an afterlife. Now, do I want an afterlife? Do you? Do you want to live indefinitely? You can have your feelings about what you want to happen, but that's a different situation than asking whether or not it's true and whether or not science tells us it's true. That's all.